you were the head of the USAID, and we are seeing what's happening to the USAID now. How do you see like the destruction of the USAID?
Well, first of all, it's been personally devastating to have had the privilege of running this agency that has existed from President Kennedy until January 20th of this year, 2025, and to have experienced 4 years of getting to go out into the world and see the good that USAID has been doing in educating girls, in helping people prevent deforestation, in popping up a solar panel to electrify an entire village that won't get electrified for another 50 years, in combating malaria, TB. I could go on and on and on. And so I walked out of USAID on January 20th thinking that the Trump administration would cut some of the programming that we did, for example, on climate change, given that they believe in climate denial and don't think that they need to do anything about the devastation caused by climate change. The idea that they would, at the time they talk about competing with China, at the time they talk about opening markets for US businesses, that they would cut something so valuable that did so much good around the world, not only for the people in these communities that were affected, but also for the United States, it never even entered my mind. And so it has been absolutely, it's a shock, and it's a devastating shock, and the estimates are that 14 million people will die because of the decision to dismantle USAID.
So can you talk more about the impact of the destruction of the USAID?
Well, most of the life and death figures, like the 14 million people who will die because of the cuts, that is measured most easily through humanitarian assistance cuts, for example, to Venezuelan refugees, to people who've been displaced from their homes in Gaza, you name it. There's refugees, of course, all over the world, and internally displaced people all over the world. But it also means allowing warehouses full, for example, of malaria bed nets to remain closed, to remain shuttered. Decisions made that medicine, even that had already been purchased, could not be distributed because USAID, it was like a cliff. They cut off these funding programs, so it was not a slow glide where people could adjust, you could find other donors, you could open the warehouse and distribute the bed nets. It was almost out of spite to allow the programs to be terminated that abruptly. So I think what you'll see in public health and in humanitarian assistance are just higher mortality rates in places where a soup kitchen might have been made available. Or one of the things that USAID did really, really well over the last 4 or 5 years especially is get this something called plumpy nut, which is a ready-to-use therapeutic food to under 5 children who are on the brink of starvation. And this is kind of like a miracle paste. And we had purchased $200 million worth of plumpy nut. It was all ready to go. Boom, slamming the door on this kind of programming. So again, you will start to see these metrics coming in over the years. Sadly, other wealthy democracies are not filling the gaps. They too are making cuts. They look at Trump and they say, okay, well, if he's cutting that much, if we cut just a little bit, maybe that's okay. There's a lot of pressure by the United States on European governments to spend on their militaries. Every dollar they spend on their military is a dollar they are taking away from development and humanitarian assistance. I think what's going to be less visible are not the mortality numbers, the life and death numbers. It is going to be that girl who doesn't get educated, and then the income that she brings back to her community, or indeed the fact that she will now have many more children than she would have had she received a secondary education, and how that can contribute to cycles of poverty. The clean energy that could power whole villages and communities that will not get electrified by connecting to the central grid anytime probably in my lifetime. And yet, thanks to these clean energy technologies, you can just actually electrify almost like a miracle. And that allows surgeons to perform surgeries on people and not fear that the power is going to go out as you're operating on somebody. It allows a child to stay up later at night and use the lights from electricity to actually read a book and enhance their education. So those kinds of knock-on effects won't be measured in the number of people who lose their lives because of the dismantlement of USAID, but in these much more long-term development effects. The other thing that will be hard to measure is how what we call soft power suicide is going to hurt the United States in again, ways that may not be specifically measurable. I was thinking as I was preparing to speak with you today about what is the analogy for Brazil. And I think it would be as if Brazil decided no more music, no more football, you know, all those yellow T-shirts with the green that are all over the world, the Brazilian jerseys and scarves and things that project Brazil's reputation for football or for culture or for music out into the world. Stop it. You know, overnight, what would that mean for Brazil's reputation? Well, it has a big reputation from all of the years of being a great football powerhouse or having the music and the culture that it has. But people would say, why the hell are you doing that? This is, you know, the United States is not only popular abroad. There are many things the United States has done, including in Latin America over the years, that have made it very unpopular, where there's a lot of suspicion. One of the few things that the United States has done that nobody complains about and people remember really fondly, the Peace Corps and USAID programming. And to take that away overnight, it's dumb and it's cruel.
And after the destruction, do you think that it can be rebuilt in the future, or it will be really hard?
Well, I think that definitely the cracks that we are seeing right now in President Trump's domination of Republican politics in the US are relevant to the answer to that question. There was not one program that USAID did that Republicans on the relevant committees in the Congress didn't go along with. In other words, Republicans backed USAID's work in the world, including by writing very large checks to USAID. We were a $40 billion agency the last year that I ran USAID, which was just last year. So Republicans supported what USAID did in the world. They want to compete with China. They like American compassion being enshrined on the global stage. It's really relevant in terms of the question of whether USAID or a foreign assistance arm of the United States will come back into being. That President Trump is slowly losing support from his own Republican coalition. I mention that because Republicans had really supported what USAID had done over the decades. They've ebbed and flowed. They don't support everything. They didn't like our work on reproductive health, some of it. They don't like the work maybe in family planning or on climate change, clean energy transition. Fine. But the vast majority of what USAID did in the world had strong Republican support. Yet, when Elon Musk and Donald Trump destroyed the agency earlier this year, none of those Republicans who had been championing that work spoke up. They were afraid. They were terrified by the misinformation that was out there and being seen to support not USAID, but a caricature of USAID, a distorted vision of what we were doing. I mean, some people were saying we were an agency that just provided abortions around the world. That's crazy. That's illegal. That's not something USAID has ever done or thought about doing. So these Republicans who supported the work that we did became very quiet, very cowardly, and they know the human effects out in the world. So if you start to see Republicans speaking up on other issues, domestic issues, like, for example, whether congressional maps should be redrawn in Indiana, you saw Republicans defying the will of President Trump and saying, no, we don't want to redraw our maps. We already have most of the seats here. We know that our voters will not like us being part of this, and they spoke up. You see divisions in the Republican Party about whether Nazis should be allowed in the party, whether they should be welcome. You see people speaking up about that. On Gaza, you actually saw people before the ceasefire speaking up and pressing President Trump to be harder on the government of Israel. So you see little examples of dissent and advocacy on behalf of things that President Trump is not pursuing or in defiance of his will. And I think starting probably next year, especially if Democrats take the House of Representatives in the midterm, you will probably start to see quietly people behind the scenes coming together to think about, okay, now that we are safe to raise our voices, what does this mean for foreign assistance? As it stands right now, though, the harms are being perpetrated all around the world, including right here in Latin America.
You wrote in the New York Times in February that the autocrats would benefit from the destruction of the USAID. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, one of the, I've mentioned in our discussion today, mostly programs in health and education and clean energy and economic development. But one of the other things that the United States has been involved in over the years is supporting, for example, training for independent media, training for anti-corruption lawyers, training for judges in the judiciary to make sure that they independently, or to give them support at least in independently enforcing the rule of law and not bringing a kind of political mindset to the bench. These kinds of programs broadly fell under the umbrella of democracy programming. All of that programming now has been canceled, and many of the key democracy organizations that support this kind of anti-corruption work, for example, around the world, those organizations have been dismantled right along with USAID, because USAID was responsible for a big share of their budget. So autocrats in countries where that work was happening, where independent media were getting training on how to survive the internet, because so many independent journalists are having a hard time basically making a profit in this digital world, and USAID would give them finance training on, how to build paywalls and not on content. USAID was never involved in the content of what journalists were doing, but it was premised on the idea that pluralism and transparency are good for democratization and for human rights. So that support is not coming. The European Union has not made up that support. They were never big funders in these domains. A lot of the anti-corruption work that brave advocates were doing to look into where government officials were actually taking money from the citizens and which bank accounts they were putting that money in, a lot of that work is no longer happening. So if you are corrupt, if you are planning to steal an election, if you are planning to rig an election before the election occurs, if you are planning to lock up not only independent candidates or opposition candidates, but to terrorize their supporters. It is absolutely the case right now, thanks to President Trump's decision to dismantle USAID, that there is going to be less attention to those actions than there were before the dismantling of USAID. And the great thing is, citizens are brave. They do this work whether they have an organization to do it or not, because they care so much about their communities. They care about the stealing of taxpayer resources by government officials or by oligarchs. So some of that work, of course, is still happening, but there is by definition less of it because it is not being resourced in the way that it once was.